Panel is here, joining us from their remote locations, MSNBC anchor Joshua Johnson, Maria Teresa Kumar, president of Voto Latino, and former Republican Governor Pat McCrory of North Carolina. By the way, if anybody wonders if we do tape this live, you now have proof that we do this live. I want to begin with hearing what we heard from the president on Friday in his sort of longest remarks about the situation in Minnesota. Take a listen.
Well, I think that police brutality certainly is something that we've been hearing about, reading about, studying. I have for many years. And we all have to say, and I think most people would admit, that most of the policemen and women that I've seen have been outstanding. When you have something like this happen, you look at it and you just say, how does a thing like that happen? Because it just seems so bad to watch.
So that was President Trump, and I want to compare it to what former President Obama said. He put out this statement. It's natural to wish for life to, quote, get back to normal, as a pandemic and an economic crisis upend everything around us. But we have to remember that for millions of Americans, being treated differently on account of race is tragically, painfully, maddeningly normal, whether it's while dealing with the healthcare system or interacting with the criminal justice system or jogging down the street or just watching birds in a park. Joshua Johnson, I felt like in those ways, you could tell those were the remarks of two people with two very different life experiences.
Two people with two very different life experiences, but each one makes a valid point, I think. President Obama certainly makes a very valid point in terms of the treatment of African Americans. President Trump also makes a point that most policemen and women are probably outstanding, at least at following their orders. What I saw from last night, from anchoring some of our coverage on MSNBC, was that the issue may be with the orders. The heavy-handedness, I think, comes from higher up than just the officers. I would love to know from every governor and mayor in the country whether any of their standing orders to any of the uniformed officers on the street included protect the protesters. Those protesters were exercising their First Amendment rights, as were my colleagues, including some who were hit with tear gas canisters. And I'm wondering whether or not the right to protest for improved law enforcement was lost in the push to reclaim the streets. It's amazing how much power a handful of people, in the context of the whole nation, a handful of people who broke a handful of windows and set a handful of cars and shops on fire, militarized the entire law enforcement apparatus of the entire nation. It reminded me of that line from the movie The Dark Knight: introduce a little anarchy, upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos. I am amazed at how quickly that happened. So even though both Presidents Obama and President Trump have a point, I think the problem is with that piece of what President Trump said about the outstanding work of policemen and women. We clearly have varying definitions in this country of what outstanding means.
Pat McCrory, you've been both a governor and a mayor, and I know you've said you had your own, I think, dealt with some of these issues in the past via demonstrations. But I'm curious, if the president called you up and asked for some advice on how to talk about this differently, what would you tell him?
Well, I'd say exactly what some of the other representatives said, but the dilemma you have, as we had in 2016 when I had to call the National Guard to a city where I'd been mayor for 14 years, you do have these groups of anarchists that the governor of Minnesota and the mayor of St. Paul and Minneapolis said very well, and it needs to be exposed. You have a small group of violent people, domestic terrorists, who follow the concept of the art of war. They'll hit and run, they'll break windows, they'll set fires, then they'll run, and even using social media, they'll maneuver around very well-trained police officers who are trained to do riots. And this is why they cause so much destruction within a peaceful protest. It literally only takes 5 to 20 people to cause this destruction and cause this massive call for National Guard, which I had to do. By the way, when these poor mayors and governors have to bring in the National Guard, it's not something you can snap your finger at. These National Guard are coming from small towns from throughout Minnesota or Georgia who maybe have never even been to these big cities. And you've got to ensure that they have the training, and they might even get lost within the downtown structures of these cities. So it's a very complex situation in which you're dealing with people with legitimate protests, but you're also dealing with people that are basic terrorists.
Maria Teresa, you know, one of the things that I've heard a lot of people express is that in some ways this moment was inevitable. It just was in that, I mean, how much more, particularly if you look at what's happened in the African American community, communities in color in general have gotten hit harder by this virus, both economically and on health outcomes. Then you throw this on top of it. It's sort of like, what did we expect? I've heard some people say.
Well, right after President Obama, after the death of Eric Gardner, President Obama convened a 21st century policing task force. The purpose of it was to bring community groups such as Voto Latino. We brought together law enforcement, we brought in government, we brought in business. And the idea was, how do you actually solve this idea of police brutality? How do you retrain the policing task force so that it's more based on community? So that there is this idea that instead of bringing people in from the outside, as the governor was saying, actually having people who are rooted in the community to do the policing and making sure that they are not using police brutality. Right now, we have President Trump wringing his fingers, trying to figure out what he should be doing. Chuck, one of the first things that President Trump did to the DOJ was scrap that community building program that addresses police brutality to ensure that there's a partnership. We need right now a leadership that recognizes that there are some bad apples in the police department, but that there also are solutions. Just like he basically is wringing his hands trying to figure out how to address the pandemic, when Secretary Rice has shared that she left a 22, 38-page document on how to deal with the pandemic, people have been left with actual blueprints in the White House, and instead they basically absolve themselves of responsibility instead of taking that leadership that the country needs right now.
All right, I'm going to pause the conversation there. Hello from Washington, I'm Chuck Todd, and thanks for checking out the Meet the Press channel on YouTube. Click on the button down here to subscribe and click over here to watch the latest interviews, highlights, and other digital exclusives.